Joining me now is Dr. Parth Patel, who is an NHS doctor and senior fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research. Good morning to you, Dr. Patel. May I start by asking you, as somebody who was on the front line during the pandemic, does it matter to you personally whether the former Prime Minister was in contempt of Parliament?
Well, yes, it certainly does, both from from that perspective of someone working in hospital, but actually just as a citizen of this country, to hold Parliament in contempt is quite a big deal. Parliament is the institute that represents people up and down this country. So for a government and a Prime Minister to mislead, that is to mislead the public. So that's quite a big problem in the concept of a parliamentary democracy. There's one important thing to clarify here. That Boris Johnson misled Parliament or not is quite clear. He did mislead Parliament. The key question here is, did he knowingly mislead Parliament? And that's what the debate is about. That's what the Privileges Committee is looking at. It's published this interim report that says it's suggestive that he did. Boris Johnson obviously come out and said that is not true, and he will give evidence to that committee in 3 weeks' time. After that, we will have a verdict. But that key question is, did he knowingly mislead Parliament, not whether he did or not? Because, to be frank, yes, he did.
He repeatedly asserted in Parliament that all rules and guidance were followed at all times. If it's found that he knowingly misled, i.e. he knowingly knew that rules and guidance was not being followed, how does that make you feel, being a senior member of the health service who was on the front line during this deadly pandemic?
Well, I mean, frustrated, disappointed, I think. You can look at this from the perspective of being someone who works within the health service, but like I said, it's actually a problem for everyone up and down this country. It's the Prime Minister misleading people who are representing the rest of us within within our democracy, right? That is just, it's not just disrespectful, it's problematic in the sense that it's quite a hallmark of authoritarian behavior. It's actually inherently anti-democratic. So it's not just an issue of that is disrespectful, he lied to Parliament, even though he should have known better. It's more than that. It actually undermines the whole concept of a parliamentary democracy, the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, the idea that people and citizens should be represented within decision-making and governance, because actually quite clearly what Boris Johnson is suggesting, and there's some other hallmarks of his tenure as well, where he suggested he undermined Parliament, it sort of feeds into that. And I think that is a big problem.
Let's move on to the revelation of Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages. What have you found surprising about the way internally the government was trying to manage its response to the pandemic from those messages?
Yeah, there's a few things you can sort of read into from the Matt Hancock sort of messages that have been leaked. There's sort of a process by which they've come out and sort of come into the public realm, but there's also sort of what we can understand or ascertain from reading them. I think the top messages, it's quite a big insight into how sort of quite big decisions were made within government. It's sort of at that start of the pandemic where lots of us were quite confused. We didn't really know what was going on. Many of us sort of had new the existing family WhatsApp group or new WhatsApp groups being set up, and sort of people sending anxious messages, someone making a badly timed joke, and sort of people basically putting in random links about the pandemic that they've read on the internet somewhere from any sort of newspaper that you read. And actually what's happened is that's exactly what was happening at the centre of government. So that's quite embarrassing, I think, for the way in which decisions are made. So it's an interesting insight in terms of how decisions are made in government. But there's two other reflections I'd like to make in terms of, again, what does it tell us about how democracy works in the UK? The first is sort of who our politicians serve, and the second is about the role of the media within our democracy. So in general, in theory, politicians are there to sort of serve the rest of us. They are our elected representatives, and they are meant to represent us. And what we saw with Matt Hancock, particularly his exchange with George Osborne, was that he was pretty interested in serving himself to make sure he sort of aesthetically hit his target to get as many tests done as possible, at the expense of actually sort of his duty to try and mitigate the number of people dying from COVID-19. Now, you might say, well, is that surprising? Politicians are there just to serve themselves. The problem is actually that's gotten a lot worse. Back in sort of the 70s, only about 1 in 3 people in the country said actually politicians are just there to serve themselves. Now it's about 2 in 3 people. Hardly anyone thinks that politicians today are acting in the national interest. That, again, is a kind of big problem in the idea of democracy. And in terms of the role of the media, I'll just say one thing. Again, this is Matt Hancock's exchange with George Osborne. And again, the role of the free press is to try and hold power to account, against act on behalf of people up and down the country, to inform citizens, to hold people who are making decisions to account. And actually what we saw was a bit of collusion there between Matt Hancock and George Osborne to try and place a story on the front page to try and make Matt Hancock look a little bit better to the public. That too is problematic. Now, we can't infer too much, but those are 2 anecdotes that I think sort of stand out to tell us a little bit about how democracy and governance in this country is working.
Dr. Parth Patel, good to get your thoughts on Sky News. Thank you.
Thanks.